The Hobbit by J.R.R. Tolkien, Chapter 7 or Chapter 8, Part 3. Flies and Spiders. Philly or Killy, he thought by the tip of a blue hood sticking out at the top. Most likely Philly, he thought by the tip of the long nose poking out of the winding threads. He managed by leaning over to cut most of the strong, sticky threads that bound him around, and then, sure enough, with a kick and a struggle, most of Philly emerged. I am afraid Bilbo actually laughed at the sight of him jerking his stiff arms and legs as he danced on the spider string under his armpits, just like one of those funny toys bobbing on a wire. Somehow or other, Philly was got onto the branch, and when he did his best to help the hobbit, although he was feeling very sick and ill from spider poison, and from hanging most of the night and the next day, wound round and round with only his nose to breathe through. It took him ages to get the beastly stuff out of his eyes and eyebrows, and as for his beard, he had to cut most of it off. Well, between them, they started to haul up first one dwarf and then another and slash them free. None of them were better off than Philly, and some of them were worse. Some had hardly been able to breathe at all. Long noses are sometimes useful, you see, and some had been more poisoned. In this way, they rescued Killy, Bifur, Bofur, Dori, and Nori. Poor old Bomber was so exhausted he was the fattest and had been constantly pinched and poked that he just rolled off the branch and fell plop on the ground, fortunately on the leaves, and lay there. But there were still five dwarfs hanging at the end of the branch when the spiders began to come back, more full of rage than ever. Bilbo immediately went to the end of the branch nearest the tree trunk and kept back those who crawled up. He had taken off his ring when he rescued Philly and forgotten to put it on again. So now they all began to splutter and hiss. Now we see you, you nasty little creature. We shall eat you and leave your bones and skins hanging on a tree. He's got a sting, has he? Well, we'll get him all the same, and then we'll hang him head downwards for a day or two. While this was going on, the other dwarfs were working at the rest of the captives and cutting at the threads with their knives. Soon all would be free, though it was not clear what would happen after that. The spiders had caught them pretty easily the night before, but that had been unawares, and in the dark. This time they looked like being a horrible batter. Suddenly Bilbo noticed that some of the spiders had gathered round old Bomber on the floor and had tied him up again and were dragging him away. He gave a shout and slashed at the spiders in front of him. They quickly gave away and scrambled and fell down the tree right into the middle of those on the ground. His little sword was something new in the way of sting for them. How it darted to and fro. It shone with delight as he stabbed at them. Half a dozen were killed before the rest drew off and left Bomber to Bilbo. Come down, he shouted to dwarfs on the branch. Don't stay up there and be netted. For he saw spiders swarming up all the neighborhood trees and crawling along the boughs above the heads and dwarfs. Down the dwarfs scrambled or jumped or dropped, 11 all in heap, most of them very shaky and little use on their legs. There they were at last, 12 of them, counting poor old Bombur, who was being popped up on either side by his cousin Bifur and his brother Bofur. And Bilbo was dancing about and waving his sting, and hundreds of angry spiders were goggling at them all round and above and about. It looked pretty hopeless. Then the battle began. Some of the dwarfs had knives and some had sticks, and all of them could get at stones. And Bilbo had his elvish dagger. Again and again the spiders were bitten off, and many of them were killed. But it could not go for long. Bilbo was nearly tired out. Only four of the dwarfs were able to stand firmly, and soon they would all be overpowered like weary flies. Already the spiders were beginning to weave their webs all round them again, from tree to tree. In the end, Bilbo could think of no plan except to let the dwarfs into secret of his ring. He was rather sorry about it, but it could not be helped. I am going to disappear, he said. I shall draw the spiders off if I can, and you must keep together and make in opposite direction. To the left there, that is more or less the way towards place where we last saw the elf fires. It was difficult to get them to understand what with their dizzy heads and shouts and whacking of sticks and throwing of stones. But at last Bilbo felt he could delay no longer. The spiders were drawing their circle ever closer. He suddenly slipped on his ring, and to the great astonishment the dwarfs and to the great astonishment of the dwarfs, he vanished. Soon there came the sound of lazy laugh and attercop from among the trees away on the right. That upset spiders greatly. They stopped advancing, and some went off in the direction of voice. Attercop made them so angry that they lost their wits. Then Balin, who had grasped Bilbo's plan better than the rest, laid an attack. The dwarfs huddled together in a knot, and sending a shower of stones, they drove at the spiders on the left and burst through the ring. Away behind them, now the shouting and singing suddenly stopped. Hoping desperately that Bilbo had not been caught, the dwarfs went on. Not fast enough though. They were sick and weary. They could not go much better than a hobble and wobble, though many of spiders were close behind. Every now and then they had to turn and fight the creatures that were overtaking them, and already some spiders were in the trees above them and throwing down their long clinging threads. Things were looking pretty bad again when suddenly Bilbo reappeared and charged into astonished spiders unexpectedly from the side. Go on, go on, he shouted. I will do the stinging. And he did. He darted backwards and forwards, slashing at spider threads, hacking at their legs, and stabbing at their fat bodies if they came too near. The spiders swelled with rage and spluttered and frothed and hissed out horrible curses, but they had become mortally afraid of String and dared not come very near now that it had come back. So, curse as they would, their prey moved slowly but steadily away. It was a most terrible business and seemed to take hours. But at last, just when Bilbo felt that he could not lift his hand for a single stroke more, the spiders suddenly gave it up, followed them no more, but went back disappointed to their dark colony. The dwarfs then noticed that they had come to the edge of ring where elf fires had been. Whether it was one of those they had seen the night before, they could not tell. But it seemed that some good magic lingered in such spots which the spiders did not like. At any rate, here the light was greener, the boughs less thick and threatening, and they had chance to rest and draw breath. There they lay for some time, puffing and panting, but very soon they began to ask questions. They had to have the whole vanishing business carefully explained, and the finding of the ring interested them so much that for a while they forgot their own troubles. Balin in particular insisted on having the golem story, riddles and all, told all over again, with the ring in its proper place. But after a time, the light began to fail, and the other questions were asked. Where were they? And where was their path? And where was there any food? And what were they going to do next? These questions they asked over and over again, and it was from little Bilbo that they seemed to expect to get the answers. From which you can see that they had changed their opinion of Mr. Baggins very much and had begun to have a great respect for him, as Gandalf had said they would. Indeed, they really expected him to think of some wonderful plan for helping them, and were not merely grumbling. They knew only too well that they would soon all have been dead if it had not been for the hobbit, and they thanked him many times. Some of them even got up and bowed right to the ground before him, though they fell over with the effort and could not get on their legs again for some time. Knowing the truth about the vanishing did not lessen their opinion of Bilbo at all, for they saw that he had some wits as well as luck and a magic ring, and all three were very useful possessions. In fact, they praised him so much that Bilbo began to feel there really was something of a bold adventurer about himself after all, though he would have felt a lot bolder still if there had been anything to eat. But there was nothing, nothing at all, and none of them were fit to go and look for anything or to search for lost path. The lost path. No other idea would come into Bilbo's tired head. He just sat staring in front of him at the endless trees, and after a while they all fell silent again. All except Balin. Long after the others had stopped talking and shut their eyes, he kept on muttering and chuckling to himself. Golem, well, I am blessed. So that's how he sneaked past me, is it? Now I know. Just crept quietly along, did you, Mr. Baggins? Buttons all over the doorstep. Good old Bilbo, 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 bo, bo, bo. And then he fell asleep, and there was a complete silence for a long while. All of a sudden, Dwalin opened an eye and looked around at them. Where is Thorin? He asked. It was a terrible shock. Of course, there were only 13 of them, 12 dwarves and hobbit. Where indeed was Thorin? They wondered what evil fate had befallen him, magic or dark monsters, and shuddered as they lay lost in the forest. There they dropped off one by one in uncomfortable sleep full of horrible dreams, as evening wore to black night, and there we must leave them for a present, too sick and weary to set guard or to take turns at watching. Thorin had been caught much faster than they had. You remember Bilbo falling like a log into sleep as he stepped into circle of light? The next time it had been Thorin who stepped forward, and as the lights went out, he fell like a stone enchanted. All the knights of the dwarfs lost in the night, their cries as spiders caught them and bound them, and all sound of the battle next day had passed over him unheard. Then the wood elves had come to him and bound him and carried him away. The feasting people were wood elves, of course. These are not wicked folk. If they have a fault, it is distrust of strangers. Though their magic was strong, even in those days they were wary. They differed from the high elves of the west and were more dangerous and less wise, for most of them, together with their scattered relations in the hills and mountains, were descended from the ancient tribes that never went to Fairy in the west. There the light elves and deep elves and sea elves went and lived for ages and grew fairer and wiser and more learned and invented their magic and their cunning craft in the making of beautiful and marvelous things before some came back into wild world. In the wide world, the wood elves lingered in the twilight of our sun and moon, but loved best the stars. And they wandered in the great forest that grew tall in lands that are now lost. They dwelt most often by the edges of woods from which they could escape at times to hunt or to ride and run over open lands by moonlight or starlight. And after the coming of men, they took ever more and more to the gloaming and the dusk. Still, else they were and remain, and that is good people. In a great cave some miles within the edge of Mirkwood on its eastern side there lived at this time their greatest king. Before his huge doors of stone, a river ran out of the heights of forest and flowed on and out into marshes at the feet of a high wooded lands. This great cave, from which countless smaller ones opened out on every side, wound far underground and had many passages and wide halls. But it was lighter and more wholesome than any goblin dwelling, and neither so deep nor so dangerous. In fact, the subjects of the king mostly lived and hunted in the open woods, and had houses or huts on the ground and in the branches. The beeches were their favorite trees. The king's cave was his palace and the strong place of his treasure, and the fortress of his people against their enemies. It was also the dungeon of his prisoners. So to the cave they dragged Thorin, not too gently, for they did not love dwarfs and thought he was an enemy. In ancient days, they had had wars with some of the dwarfs whom they accused of stealing their treasure. It is only fair to say that dwarfs gave a different account and said that they only took what was their due, for the elf king had bargained with them to shape his raw gold and silver and had afterwards refused to give them their pay. If the elf king had a weakness, it was for treasure, especially for silver and white gems. And though his hoard was rich, he was ever eager for more, since he had not yet as great a treasure as other elf lords of old. His people neither mined nor worked metals or jewels, nor did they bother much with trade or with tilling the earth. All this was well known to every dwarf, though Thorin's family had had nothing to do with the old quarrel I have spoken of. Consequently, Thorin was angry at their treatment of him when they took their spell of him and he came to his senses. And also, he was determined that no word of gold or jewels should be dragged out of him. The king looked sternly on Thorin when he was brought before him and asked him many questions, but Thorin would only say that he was starving. Why did you and your folk 3 times try to attack my people at their merrymaking? Asked the king. We did not attack them, answered Thorin. We came to beg because we were starving. Where are your friends now, and what are they doing? I don't know, but I expect starving in the forest. What were you doing in the forest? Looking for food and drink because we were starving. But what brought you into forest at all? Asked the king angrily. At that, Thorin shut his mouth and would not say another word. Very well, said the king. Take him away and keep him safe until he feels inclined to tell the truth, even if he waits 100 years. Then the elves put thongs on him and shut him in one of the inmost caves with strong wooden doors and left him. They gave him food and drink, plenty of both, if not very fine, for wood elves were not goblins and were reasonably well behaved even to their worst enemies when they captured them. The giant spiders were the only living things they had no mercy upon. There in King's dungeon, poor Thorin lay, and after he had got over his thankfulness for bread and meat and water, he began to wonder what had become of his unfortunate friends. It was not very long before he discovered, but that belongs to next chapter and the beginning of another adventure in which the hobbit again showed his usefulness. End of chapter 8. Flies and spiders. So, do you know who flies are or where?